You later. Hondo, George, I love you, but I just don't understand how this deck is gonna like fight into the meta. I don't think it's amazing. So I'm gonna, out of respect for George, I'm gonna put it at the bottom of my B tier. I think it's got some cool grindy options, but like I'm not playing, like 3 resource tutus. I just don't know why I would want to do that. Boy, was I wrong. Guys, I'm going to be honest. When I looked at the Hondo deck, I definitely underestimated it. One thing that I saw when I saw George doing so well with it and kind of being the only person championing it, I saw a good pilot playing what I thought was kind of an inefficient deck, taking up a lot of resources to play some cards that I really didn't value very highly. But man, this deck really is more than the sum of its parts. I kind of saw that a bit when I was playing Hero Boba. When you have a leader that basically upgrades every card in your deck, it can be hard to evaluate, especially when they come out on 6. It can be tough. That's generally been a pain point for leaders, to come out on 6 and try to establish the board. But with Hondo, letting you upgrade your guys and leaning into some of those really strong blue green cards, the removal, the barrages, and just generally some good value plays, you're actually able to kind of ward them off or even pressure them before your flip turn and use your flip turn a little more proactively, which is really cool. So, I gotta eat my words a little bit on that one with the comment about the Star Hoppers. They're a great role player. Whether it's soaking damage from all or diversifying your threats, pumping an Inferno 4 or itself. There's a lot of things you can do there. Man, and in the way the meta's been going, it's been kind of going into this grindy portion of the second half of this meta or whatever you want to call it. It's been getting a bit more grindy, and this is, smuggle and upgrades. That is the recipe for a good grindy deck. So I've been able to exploit a lot of these mid-range soft control decks. Even you can pressure some of the harder control decks. Like when you have a 4-5 Inferno 4 beating them down and they have a hard time removing it, you can really get ahead on them. So man, shout out to George for championing this deck, bringing it to the forefront and being such a good collaborator with the deck. I've obviously taken it and made it my own. Some of the same advice I give to everyone else, and so I'm going to go through some of those changes. But yeah, this is something I thought I wouldn't say. This is the KTOD Matty Hondo deck tech. Let's get it. All right, y'all. This is it. This is the KTOD Matty Hondo Blue, baby. Some big things you are going to notice off the rip. I'm rocking my boy Embo. I think that this deck really wants to be fighting a lot and accruing value through combat, through pumping your guys, healing them with covert strength. And so in my mind, Embo is perfect for that game plan. He fights really well, especially once you upgrade him to like a 4-5. And he keeps guys on the board. So one of the big points about this deck is it's all about accruing value. Because you have smuggle, you basically have another row of cards that are available to your disposal. So the way that I've played the game with the paradigm of really trying to just outvalue my opponent, especially in those mid rangy controlling matchups. Obviously there's times against like harder control or something like a Palp where you want to pressure them, but in the general game plan of playing against decks like Kira or Han Blue, Boba Green, stuff like that, you really want to go ahead and just try to out card advantage of them. So I basically do like a how much value am I getting out of each card kind of calculation. I'm really just trying to like get 1.5 to 2 cards worth out of every one of my cards, and usually we get to the late game and they run out of stuff and I'm able to win. So Embo being able to upgrade to a 4-5, heal people once he takes somebody out, just goes a long way towards that game plan. Another card that I've decided to change up from George's list and play is Viper Probe Droid. I think there's some really cool lines you can take with Ruthless Assassin, the 3/3 that shoots somebody, and I've definitely have times where it like helped me with First Light, getting a little extra damage in. But so like for me, I wanted to go with something a little more consistent. And then also like when you're playing a deck that upgrades its guys, like I want to know like what kind of removal do they have? Do they have bounce? So getting that hand knowledge from Viper Probe Droid before I all in on say a covert strength line is really important. So he's been a huge MVP for me, and he's still, you can timely him out of the smuggle row on your 4 resource to still hit something for 4. Yeah, it might not live after, but like that's still a line that is really important. So still having that at your disposal is huge. And then I'm playing 3 Overwhelming Barrage. I think that card is absolutely nuts, especially in a deck where you are upgrading your guys. So for me, it was a no-brainer to move that to 3, although understanding that, your Chilton is going to have some different math associated with him, which is a great point to bring up. I think a lot of people get kind of caught in the weeds on Chilton, and one thing that I noticed people weren't doing enough in Kira is like kind of skipping a turn to make sure, unless you have a Pershing, like skipping a turn to make sure you get him upgraded. So the good thing about Hondo with him is like you can skip a turn out of the cards in your hand and still be proactive. So, I mean, you can lead with Inferno 4 into a Star Hopper out of the row. And so you've done something, but now your Chilton isn't getting neutered. He still has the chance to be a 6/6 because you played something out of your row and not the cards in your hand. Which that play line of Inferno 4 into a smuggle, guys, when I was learning this deck, so many times I put a card on top that I needed and then smuggled and put it into my row and goofed that up. So when you're playing this deck, be mindful if you're going to smuggle on a turn to put the card that you really want second to the top with your Inferno 4. Just kind of a funny goof up I did a lot in my early testing with this deck. But like I said, the whole game plan here is all about value. Playing an attrition war where you're going to have more cards at your disposal because of all the smuggle has been so instrumental. And the cool thing about this deck is like you can pressure those mid-rangey and soft control and even the control decks like pretty heavily, leading with an Inferno 4 into a Star Hopper. Now you have 2 guys out there that are beating them down. In a lot of games I've actually won with Maul just overwhelming a injured or, any kind of unit really at the end, against Han, against Palp, against Kira, all those things. So like when I look at this deck, like, yeah, you want to grind people out, but like you can start pressuring them really well. And so that's definitely a line to look for, which is why I really like the Probe Droid start of like, hey, what do they got going on? Like, how can I maneuver it? What's the best way to pressure them? So I think he's really been a good MVP there and adding him to the list. Because of Chilton, like you do have some deck building constraints. You do need to keep it pretty blue, which I think is worth it. Like I've thought about playing ramp and trying to attack some of the harder control decks with stuff like Relentless, which I have 1 in the sideboard right now because we're seeing a huge rise in blue Bosk, and I kind of want to have something else there. But you don't really run out of threat, so you can. As long as you keep your removal for their few big things that they have to finish out the game, you can pressure them pretty well. You just have to be careful with all the smuggle. You can get into like, hey, I'm going to get decked range. So that is a constraint against like a Blue Ray who can grind really well, or, a deck like Bosk. You just want to be mindful of your smuggling so that you're not milling yourself out. Another really good play line, going back to Chilton, is smuggling a Chilton. I did this against the Boba, and it was just so sick. Timeling Chilton to get the +1 to make him a 7/7 ambush is like absolutely cracked. Probably one of my favorite plays. You don't always get to line it up, but when you do, it kind of feels like game over from there. Yeah, just an absolute stunner of a play line. One thing that I definitely underestimated here is the fact that like you are able to end a lot of games through your aerial kind of attack. Like I mentioned with the Inferno 4 and the Star Hopper, like later in the game, keeping say against like Sabine, keeping the ground clear because they love to like ambush guys in and do overwhelm. Keeping the ground clear and pumping up those guys and then like dropping, a Vigilant Pursuit Craft, which has a big booty, and hitting barrages to kind of keep them out of it. You can actually race them. I've found some games against Sabine where if they weren't able to contest me in the air, I actually was able to race them, hit a barrage, and move on with my life, which is why I like having the third barrage in there. It could easily be a third Vigilance if you're really worried about the Sabine matchup. But I found like a lot of times I need to resource barrage early to set up a Childson, and so I wanted to have one more in the deck, so I didn't feel so bad resourcing. Because if you resource one and there's only one left, obviously that can be problematic. So just to summarize, like some of the play points before going into the sideboard, for me, most of the time, unless I really am worried about kind of removal or balance, I love starting with Inferno 4, setting up those smuggles and really pressuring them early in the air. From there, I feel like, on your 4 resource turn, dropping a big Chilton is the move. And when you can't, looking to maybe timely in a 2-drop to kind of fight on the board, or, using one of your removal, like a takedown or a power dockside, just to keep the hits rolling, is completely reasonable as well. 5 resource turn, if I'm not barraging, I'm trying to set up like a good timely Death Trooper, timely Embo. I'm really not dropping Super Commando Squad right off the rip on 5 unless I feel pretty confident he's going to stick around. But I still think he's worth the slot. It's just like curving out and taking your whole turn right away can be a little bit scary into the meta with the bounce and some of the ways that people have of dealing with a shielded Sentinel. But he is pretty dope at kind of gumming them up, especially if you can find a way to like keep your Hondo alive on his flip turn. Like I love dropping one of those Sentinels to kind of pair with that. One play line that wasn't super apparent to me early, but has been really good, is like sometimes when you flip your Hondo, sometimes you just want to go mega with him. And so there's times when like I'm not really worried about setting up a timely, so I'm just burning the 2 resource timely just to pump him, like a 2 resource spell that gives somebody a +1/+1. Like I think that's a completely reasonable thing. A lot of times like you can pressure early enough in the air to kind of get them looking that way, and then you can flip Hondo, make them beefy, get in an attack, and then it's like one more attack into a maul swing. And then finally, like one other play line that doesn't present itself a ton, but when it does, wins you the game, is like First Light. First Light was like on my chopping block a lot early because it just like wasn't working for me. It was nice to have in the row, but I never really used it. But there's just like 1 out of 6-7 games where you go to the air with like a Vigilant Pursuit Craft into First Light and you just steal the game, where you would have had a lot of trouble getting that extra damage in. So as much as I'm a Vader fan, Maul is really shining in this deck because of, like what I said, you're using him as reach, getting that extra damage in with First Light, and moving on. 1 Super Laser Blast, obviously, because you are trying to like build a board. And so I don't really see the need to have 2, whereas like in Akira 30, I would want more. Although like Super Laser Blast into, some of the smuggle stuff can be really good late game. So it's kind of like your oh crap button, especially against some of those blue hero decks that put out a lot of hits. I don't really have much to say about Snoke. He's just an insane value play. You can pump him up, and then he's like impossible to kill, which is sick. I thought about whether I want Snoke or Avenger, but without the ramp, getting to 9 could be a little bit problematic, where like you drop Snoke and some decks just like can't deal with it. So he's been awesome. So like I think my main deck is probably only like 5 cards off from George's, so he really gave a good foundation, and from there it was just kind of making this deck my own with the play lines that I saw available to me. I love how this deck pressures, I love how this deck grinds, and so the sideboard is really just shoring up some of the matchups, so I'll go into that now. All right, guys, so on to the sideboard, shoring up matchups like I mentioned. Look, I mean, Sabine is always going to be in your eyesight, in your mind, so we got 4 cards for that matchup, primarily the top target into the Vigilance. Top target has been insane in any blue deck that I'm playing against Sabine. They play a lot of good unique units and the ability to negate one of their big plays and keep your life total pretty low in the early game, so that way their late game reach isn't as effective, is like a huge way to counter a play. When you pair it with something like a vigilance, you can get a kind of insane heal. There is a consideration to play even like client out of the sideboard and pair and play kind of that Healy bounty game in more mid-range matchups. But what I found against Sabine and why I took it out is like the way the actions work, I wasn't getting enough heals out of the client. And even if I slammed it right on 3. And so like the client's good where I'm playing a lot of mid-range, and I feel like this deck already fights well into mid-range. So that's kind of why I left him on the sidelines and favored the Embo. But you could, if you're like, hey, I'm going to play against all mid-rangey and yellow boba decks all day, I could see pairing top target and the client in the sideboard and trimming some of the top end. But top target's just such a valuable card. I think 3 is perfect. Making sure you have 3 vigilance, and that could be in the main deck. It's up to you how much you want to kind of tech early against Sabine. Is kind of just a game plan thing. Like I said, like I want the barrage, third barrage for Sabine. So like, I mean, maybe you could bump a Super Laser Blast or something, but I kind of like where the deck's at, and I think 2 is okay, but something to consider. With the rise of Boba's armor and kind of like Boba unit leader being kind of a bigger threat, I like having Rivals Fall. I think that's one way you can kind of lose to the Boba decks, even though I've had a lot of success, is if they just make a really big Boba leader and you're not able to get that Chilton playoff, like I talked about it in time. Suiting up Boba with Boba armor kind of goes into the whole like value game plan, and I think they can actually outvalue us with that because he's not taking damage, he's super tanky. He's paired with like Barrages himself in the green version, or Cunning's in the yellow. So I think Rivals Fall is huge there. And you have stuff like against those decks that, that are easy to take out. Against, a deck that's running Cunning, you might not want to play Super Commando, right? Because the chance that you tap out 5 resources and he's got the 4 power for the Cunning is pretty tough. So that's a pretty good one to kind of slot out and get your Rivals Fall in there. Maul is very good at dealing with leaders, but because we don't ramp, that's a couple turns behind. So just having something at 6 that you can kind of claim and deal with the leader that drop on 5, or match a 6-turn leader drop is pretty good. Because like I've run into like Bosks playing Fallen Lightsaber at Shoutout to Mike Unplayable, who did it at Gen Con, and like that can be a problem for anyone. So just having the Rivals Fall, it's Vanquish +1. It's got a wide range. I think this is the deck that wants to play it, especially if you're looking like, hey, I don't really want to be super laser blasting this matchup. Let me go ahead and slot in Rivals Fall, which leads us to the Super Laser Blast. I think against like your Palps, where you want to beta flip and then nuke it, or some of these hero decks that kind of can use Obi to get good value and take a big board presence. Wipe's really hurtful against them. And then like Star Destroyers are just such good value, man. Like I've considered main decking 1 or 2 Avengers, but right now, but without the ramp, I like kind of topping out at 8. So like Avenger Timely is kind of sick. I don't know how many times you're going to pull it off, but that's something that can definitely happen as the game goes later. And then for me, Relentless is just a good value card against a lot of these late game decks. We're seeing Ray have an issue with it, and then Bosk is like one of those decks where I feel like dropping an Avenger, a Relentless, they have to burn some cards out of their hand, but like a lot of their removal, I feel like, is going to have an issue with it. So kind of like using that to solidify a board state before they can wipe, claiming on a turn where maybe they weren't gonna, and then dropping it could be a good play there. So yeah, that's the board. Cards I'm considering are Reinforcement Walker. Like maybe there's a matchup. Chilton's so insane, but maybe there's a matchup you want to cut him. I thought about the Relentless being a Reinforcement Walker. I tried one Reinforcement Walker in the deck. I liked it well enough, but I just didn't pull the trigger on it. So I think that would be like a bubble card for me that I might want to bring in. All right, guys. So that is my Hondo Blue deck tech with making it my own from George's deck list. Got to shout him out. He's been crushing with it and really inspired me to check this deck out. It's a lot of fun to play. I've had some of the most fun just playing and figuring out this deck. It pressures well, it grinds well, it plays blue-green cards that can control people. I think it's really well positioned right now. So I think I'm going to move it from B tier up to the top of A tier, baby. Let's go.